The morning they unloaded 43 Kiko cross dues onto what most of the county had already written off as a liability. It was a Tuesday in the first week of April 2009, and the fog was sitting so low in the hollow that you couldn't see the old stone foundation from the fence line. Temperature was 31 degrees at 6 in the morning, climbing to maybe 38 by noon, and the ground had that particular gray crust on it that you get when a late winter thaw has started but hasn't made up its mind. I was standing at the gate with my coffee, watching the trailer ramp drop, and my neighbor Harold pulled his truck up before the last doe had even cleared the tailgate. Harold drove a white 3/4 ton that always looked like it had been washed the same morning, and he rolled the window down without shutting the engine off, which was his way of letting you know he didn't plan to stay long enough to argue. He looked at the goats, then at the field behind me, then at the goats again. He said, "What are you doing putting 40-some Kikos on that ground?" Not a question exactly. More like a man reading a weather report out loud because he can't quite believe what it says. I told him I was farming. He nodded once, the way a man nods when he has decided the conversation is already over, and he said, "That land's poison," and he put the truck in gear and left. By noon, the diner in town had a version of the story, and by Friday the version had grown to the point where I had allegedly paid twice what I paid, and the goats had already died of something. I want to be honest about that part because it's a little funny from where I sit now, but I also want to be honest that standing there in that fog with 43 does picking their way across frozen ground that looked like the surface of something that had given up. I was not entirely sure Harold was wrong. The field in question was 61 acres of bottomland that had been in my family name since 1947, which meant it had been in my family name for 63 years at that point, and in all that time no one had done much with it except curse it. It sat between a ridge and a creek, and the creek had manners about half the year and no manners at all the other half. The soil survey called it Melvin Silt Loam with inclusions of Nolan, which sounds like something a soil scientist would tell you to make you feel like you'd learned something. And what it meant practically was that the ground held water the way an old boot holds water, which is to say, completely and without apology. When it was wet, it was a swamp. When it was dry, it was a crust. The brush had been building since the early 1980s when my father stopped running cattle on it after the fence went and the price of beef went with it. And by the time I inherited the parcel in 2006, it had 23 years of multiflora rose and autumn olive and box elder and a few stands of young sycamore coming up through the wet spots. And there were places in there where you could not walk without a machete, and a good reason. The county extension man had looked at it with me the year I took the deed, and he'd put his clipboard under his arm and said in the most helpful possible way that the reclamation cost on ground like this was somewhere between $1,800 and $2,200 an acre if you wanted to go mechanical and chemical, and that even after reclamation, the drainage situation would limit what you could do with it. 61 acres at $2,000 an acre is $122,000, which is the midpoint of that range and close enough to stop and think, which was a number designed to end a conversation, and it did. I put the deed in the cedar chest in the bedroom and left the ground to continue doing what it had been doing, which was growing brush nobody wanted and flooding in February and breeding mosquitoes in June. I did that for 2 years, 2006 and 2007, and most of 2008. I'll own that. I knew the ground needed attention, and I kept not giving it. But in the fall of 2008, I had a reason to go back to the cedar chest, and when I opened it to get a document I needed, the deed was sitting there on top of an old marbled composition notebook that I recognized immediately because I had seen my father carry it, and because it had his initials pressed into the cover in the particular way he had of marking things that belonged to him, not with a pen, but with a thumbnail, pressing 3 letters into the cardboard. I had not opened that notebook in years. I want to tell you why, and I want to tell you what I found when I finally did. But to tell it right, I have to go back further than 2008, back to when my father was still alive, and the ground was still his problem, and not mine, and a boy could stand at the edge of that hollow and not yet understand that some things are left to you on purpose. My father was not a man who explained himself at length. He farmed the ridge ground and rented the good river-bottom parcels when he could get them, and ran the 61 acres in the hollow as a sacrifice pasture when he had to, which is to say, he put the cattle he could afford to lose on the ground that would probably hurt them, and some years it worked, and some years it didn't. He was deliberate in most things and impatient in a few, and the few things he was impatient about were always the things that cost money to fix, and didn't show a return on any schedule a man could plan around. The hollow was one of those things. I remember him walking the fence line on the east side of that parcel when I was maybe 11 years old, so that would have been around 1973, and I was carrying the wire stretcher because I was old enough to be useful, and not yet old enough to understand that being useful often means holding something heavy while an adult does the thinking. He stopped at a low corner where the water always pooled, even in dry summers, and he crouched down and pressed 2 fingers into the soil the way you'd take a pulse, and he stayed crouched there for a while without saying anything. Then he said, "Your grandfather put something in this field." I asked him what. He said he didn't know for certain. He said your grandfather was a man who did things and wrote them down, and didn't always explain one to the other. He stood up, and we kept walking. That was the whole conversation. I didn't think about it again for a long time, the way you don't think about a thing a parent says until the parent is gone, and the thing they said is all you have left of the thinking they did. My grandfather had died in 1959, 14 years before that fence line walk, and whatever he had put in that field, if he'd put anything at all, had been in the ground for at least 20 years by the time my father crouched down and said so, and it had been in the ground for at least 57 years by the time I opened that composition notebook in the fall of 2008. The notebook was my father's, not my grandfather's. My father had started it in the late 1950s as a field record for the home place, and he'd kept it intermittently through the 1970s, which meant some years had 3 pages of close, careful notes, and some years had a single line with a date and a rainfall number, and nothing else. The penmanship was his, which was a tight, leftward-leaning cursive that I had always associated with the particular economy of a man who didn't want to waste paper. Most of it was what you'd expect: soil temperatures by field, variety trials on the ridge ground, prices received at the stockyard in a given October, the date the creek came up in 1964, and how many acres it covered. Record keeping, the kind a careful farmer does, and almost no one ever reads. But near the back of the notebook, on a page dated April of 1971, there was a section about the hollow field, and at the bottom of that section, circled in pencil with a question mark written beside it, was a single line that read, "Check depth of the original tile, the northeast lateral, never dug." That was all it said. Check depth of the original tile, the northeast lateral, never dug. I read it 3 times standing at the cedar chest in the bedroom with my reading glasses on and the overhead light on because it was already dark outside. Then I put the notebook back in the chest because it was late, and I wasn't ready, and I told myself I would think about it in the morning. I'll confess to you that morning stretched into about 6 weeks, because it was November by then, and the ground was working toward frozen, and there are always reasons not to do the thing you know you need to do. But the line stayed with me. The original tile, the northeast lateral, never dug. The word never was the one that lodged itself. Not missing, not removed, not unknown, never. As in, it had been planned, or surveyed, or started, and then not completed. My grandfather had homesteaded that bottom parcel starting in 1931, which was about the worst possible year to start anything, but he had worked it for roughly 20 years before he died, and my father took the deed. And my grandfather was, by every account I had ever been given, a man who understood that wet ground is not ruined ground. It's just ground that needs to be asked politely to let the water leave. He had put tile in 2 other fields on the home place, clay tile in 2-inch and 4-inch lines, and those fields still drained properly in 2008, 70-some years later, because tile put in right is the kind of thing that lasts longer than the man who put it in. So the question my father had written down in 1971 and never answered, and circled with a question mark, was whether my grandfather had surveyed a tile line in the northeast corner of the hollow field and then, for whatever reason, stopped before he got it in the ground. If he had surveyed it and not completed it, the question was why, and the further question, the one that started to keep me company on the long nights in December and January of that winter, was whether the survey itself was sound, whether the grade was right, and the outlet was workable, and whether 63 years of sitting unfinished had changed the answer. I went back to the notebook in January of 2009, which I am a little embarrassed to say was 2 full months after I first read that line. I read the April 1971 entry in full, and it was my father's attempt to reconstruct what my grandfather had planned. He had found something, some earlier document or stake or reference that I did not have access to, and from it he had determined that the northeast lateral was supposed to run from the high corner at the north fence, diagonally across the wet zone in the northeast quadrant of the hollow, and outlet into the creek drainage on the east side. At a natural low point my father marked with a rough sketch in the margin, a sketch that was about as artistic as you'd expect from a man who pressed his initials into his notebooks with a thumbnail, but clear enough if you knew the ground. He had noted the estimated grade as adequate, a specific phrase that my father used to mean something had been thought through and found to be workable, not generous, not ideal, but workable. And then the entry ended, and there was no follow-up. No 1972 entry about the tile, no note of completion or abandonment, just the question mark and the word never. And then the pages about other fields and other years. So in February of 2009, 6 weeks before those 43 Kiko Cross does came off the trailer, I went to see a drainage engineer named Clyde, who had been doing agricultural tile work in the county for 31 years, and who kept his office in a converted implement dealership that smelled like oil and old paper, and which I found deeply reassuring. I showed him the notebook page, and I walked him out to the hollow on a cold afternoon, and I showed him the northeast corner and the wet zone, and the natural low point on the east side, where my father's sketch said the outlet should be. Clyde walked the proposed line with a hand level and a measuring tape, and didn't say much. He probed the soil at 4 points along the route. He looked at the creek outlet for a long time. Then he said, "The grade is there." He said it the way a man says something he wanted to double-check before he said it. He said your grandfather knew what he was looking at. I asked him what it would cost to finish what my grandfather had started. He named a number. It was not a small number. It was not a $122,000 number either. But I want to tell you about the goats first, because the goats came before the tile, and the goats were their own kind of argument. The reason I had Kikos in particular, and the reason I had 43 of them, is a story that starts with a conversation I had at a farm sale in the fall of 2008. The same fall I found the notebook. The man running the goats at the sale was not a man I knew well, but he was a man I respected in the way you respect someone who farms something unusual with obvious seriousness. And what he told me over the hood of a truck in a muddy field was that Kiko crosses are browse goats first and forage goats second, which means their instinct is to work the brush layer, the multiflora rose, the autumn olive, the woody invasives, the things that a cow won't touch and a tractor can't reach, and that on rough, wet ground with heavy brush, they will clear down to soil level in a season if you fence them correctly and rotate them correctly, and don't mistake their willingness for indestructibility. He said they were not cheap, but they were not expensive either, not compared to a brush hog and a chemical crew, and what they left behind them was not bare dirt, but a disturbed and grazed and manured surface that, if you had your soil work right underneath, was ready to do something. I listened to him, and I thought about the hollow, and I thought about Clyde's number, and I thought about the line in my father's notebook, and I thought about what it might mean if two things that my family had left undone were not two unrelated problems, but one problem with two parts. The goats were part one, the tile was part two. Part one cost me $4,100 for 43, does purchase through a sale barn contact in April of 2009, consistent with what I paid, which was not a trivial sum in April of 2009, and part two cost me considerably more than that, which I will get to. But I want to tell you what 43 Kiko Cross does on 61 acres of brushy bottomland look like in practice, because it is not what I expected, and it is not what Harold expected, and it is not what the county expected. And the difference between what people expect and what actually happens is the only reason I am telling this story. What I expected was chaos. What I got was deliberate. The goats didn't crash through the brush the way a machine does. They worked it. They found the multiflora rose first, which I know because multiflora rose was what they stripped the bark from first, and they worked from the edges of each cane in, and they did it in groups, and they had a preference for working the brush that was in the wet areas rather than the dry areas, which I noticed around the third week and which I did not fully understand until later. They didn't graze the open ground much at first. They went to the brush, and they went to the wet brush in particular, the low spots where the box elder came up through standing water and the willow scrub had established along the seep lines. I watched them do this for several days before I understood what they were telling me, and what they were telling me was that the wet was not uniformly distributed across the hollow. There were lines of wet. There were seep channels in the northeast quadrant that I had always known were there but had never mapped with any precision, and the goats mapped them for me by working them first and working them hardest. I marked what I observed in a spiral notebook of my own, a cheap one I bought at the hardware store for 79 cents, and I carried it in my back pocket every morning when I walked the field, which I did every morning from late March through the end of June. I marked where the goats clustered on what days and noted the approximate soil condition in those spots and noted what they were working on. By the middle of May, I had a rough map of the wet zone in the northeast quadrant that corresponded with a closeness that I found unsettling in the best possible way to the route my grandfather had surveyed for the tile line and my father had sketched in the back of his composition notebook in April of 1971. The goats were following water, the way animals do, and the water was following the grade that my grandfather had identified in the 1940s or early 1950s, and my father had reconstructed in 1971, and Clyde had confirmed in February of 2009, and I had been walking over without understanding for most of my adult life. The field didn't care whether I understood it. It had been telling the same story since before the deed existed. I called Clyde back in June. I told him the goats had confirmed the line. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I wouldn't have thought to put it that way, but I'll allow it." We scheduled the tile work for late August, when the goats had been on the ground for 5 months, and the brush in the northeast quadrant had been knocked back enough to give a machine room to work. Before we started the tile work, I had Clyde probe the soil along the proposed line in 6 places, and I was there for each probe, and I marked the results in my spiral notebook. At 2 of the 6 probe points, we found evidence of old clay tile fragments at a depth of between 14 and 18 inches, which stopped both of us for a moment. My grandfather had not only surveyed the line, he had started it. He had put a section of tile in the ground, 2 sections actually, at points that Clyde identified as likely to have been an initial test installation, and then he had stopped, and the reason he had stopped we could not know for certain, but the tile we found was 4-inch clay, the standard size for a lateral of that length, and it was sound, which is to say 60-odd years in the ground had not broken it, which is the thing about clay tile that the people who switched to plastic in the 1970s sometimes forget. My grandfather had started the work correctly. He had just not lived long enough to finish it, and my father had found the record of the survey and had marked it "never dug," which was almost right, but not quite. Some of it had been dug. It just hadn't been connected. We ran the tile that August. 4-inch perforated plastic tying into the 2 existing clay sections that my grandfather had put in sometime in the late 1940s or early 1950s, running the full diagonal route, 260 linear feet from the high corner to the outlet. The outlet went into a 12-inch culvert that drained to the creek. Clyde installed a cleanout at the junction with the old clay tile and backfilled the trench with gravel envelope material over the pipe and native soil over that. And when the first hard rain came in September of that year, the outlet ran clear and steady for 11 hours, which Clyde said was consistent with a lateral that was drawing from the full drainage area and not from a localized wet spot. He stood at the outlet with his hands in his jacket pockets, watching the water come out, and he said one word. He said, "substantial." That was all he said. The following spring, April of 2010, the northeast quadrant of the hollow was workable ground. I walked it and pressed a soil probe in at 8 points along the old wet zone and pulled up cores that were moist but not saturated, which is the difference between ground you can farm and ground you can only look at. Harold came by that May. He drove his clean white truck up to the gate the same way he had in the fog in March of 2009, and he did not shut the engine off, which I had come to understand was simply how Harold operated and not a commentary on me specifically. He looked at the field. He could see it from the gate now, which he had not been able to do in March of 2009 because of the brush. The goats had taken the brush down to soil level across most of the 61 acres by the previous October, and what was left was rough and uneven and not pretty, but it was open ground, and the northeast quadrant had green coming up through it the way green comes up when ground that has been wet for 20 years suddenly isn't. He looked at it for a while. I waited. Harold said, "That's not as wet as it was." I told him it wasn't. He said, "What did you do?" I told him about the tile, about my grandfather's survey, about the 2 sections of old clay my grandfather had put in, and left unconnected. I did not tell him about the goats mapping the seep lines because I thought Harold might find that a step too far. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Your granddad was a thinking man." I told him he was. Harold nodded and put the truck in gear and said, "Might not be poison after all," and drove off. That was it. That was the whole concession. And I want to tell you it was enough. I didn't need more than that from Harold. I needed it from the ground. The ground had given it to me. By the fall of 2011, I had the hollow in a rotational grazing system with a small beef herd on the open ground and the Kikos working the brush margins. And I had grass on the northeast quadrant for the first time in my memory. And I had a soil test from that quadrant that showed organic matter at 4.1%, which the soil scientist at the Extension office, a quiet woman named Dr. Aldrich, who had been doing soil work in the county for 19 years, looked at for a moment before she said it was exceptional for a reclaimed wetland margin without any organic amendment, and that the grazing history was the likely explanation, and she said exceptional the way people say a word when they mean it, rather than when they're trying to make you feel good. 4.1% organic matter on ground, the county had called poison for 30 years. My grandfather had looked at that hollow in 1931 and had not seen poison. He had seen wet ground that needed to be asked politely to let the water leave. He had started the asking. He hadn't finished it. My father had found the record of the asking and had marked it with a question mark and written the word never, which was as close as he could get to an answer without digging. And I had taken 63 years of unfinished work and 2 months of looking at a notebook I was afraid to open, and 43 goats that the county thought were going to die, and one quiet drainage engineer and finish the sentence my grandfather had started. The aphorism my father wrote at the top of that April 1971 notebook page, above the sketch and the circled line, was not something I had ever heard him say out loud. It was, "The field doesn't forget what you started, and it doesn't forgive what you quit." I have thought about that sentence almost every day since I read it. I have thought about how my grandfather did not quit. He was interrupted, which is a different thing. And how my father did not quit either. He just could not quite find the end of the thread in the time he had. I found it. The finding took longer than it should have, and cost more patience than it cost money, and the patience was the only part that was genuinely free. The animals knew before I did, which is something I keep coming back to. The goats went to the wet in the northeast corner in the third week, and they worked it harder than they worked any other part of that field. And if I had not been watching them every morning with a cheap spiral notebook in my back pocket, I might have thought it was random, the way animals seem random if you're not paying attention. But animals on land they're suited to are not random. They're reading something that was written before you got there. You learn to let them read, and you learn to read what they're reading. And if you can do both of those things at the same time, then you might get somewhere your grandfather was trying to go. The numbers, since I have been careful about numbers throughout, are these, and I give them to you because I think the argument lives in the numbers and not just in the sentiment. The 61 acres came to me in 2006, valued by the county assessor at $840 an acre, which was the lowest assessed value in that tax district, and which reflected accurately what the market thought of brushy, wet bottomland with no drainage and no access road. Total assessed value, $51,240. The county extension man's reclamation estimate in 2006 was $1,800 to $2,200 an acre, mechanical and chemical, so call it $110,000 to $134,000, to put the ground into any kind of workable condition by the modern recommended method, not counting any drainage work. I did not spend anything close to that. I spent $4,100 on 43 goats in April of 2009. I spent $312 on portable electric fencing to rotational graze the hollow over 2 seasons. I spent $11,400 on Clyde's tile work in August of 2009, including materials and labor, which was the large number I mentioned earlier and which I financed over 3 years at a rate I will not complain about. I spent 79 cents on the spiral notebook. Total reclamation investment, approximately $15,811.79, against a low estimate of $110,000 by the method the Extension Office recommended. The difference is roughly $94,000, which is money I did not spend, which is the best kind of money on a farm. By 2013, the county had reassessed the parcel at $2,100 an acre, which was not rich ground by any standard, but was more than 2.5 times the 2006 assessed value of $840, and reflected a working drainage system and established grass and a provable grazing history. The tile has run without a blockage or failure since September of 2009. The Kikos that I kept back from that original 4311 does, and a buck I bought separately, have produced 3 generations of kids on that ground, and the kids that have come off the hollow land have been, by the assessment of a livestock buyer out of a sale barn about 40 miles east of here, structurally sound in a way that he attributed directly to the minerally complex soil. The word he used was complex, and he paid me a price per pound on those kids that was consistently above the barn average, which is not something I am going to give you an exact number on because it varies by year, but which has been real and consistent and has made the hollow a profitable parcel rather than a tax liability. I want to say that again because I think it is the point. The ground that the county called poison for 30 years is now the most profitable parcel on the home place per acre of land cost, because 2 old men I am related to refused to see it as poison, and because I was willing to spend a winter reading a notebook and a spring watching 43 goats work a wet hillside and write down what they were doing in 79-cent spiral notebooks until the picture was clear enough to act on. My father used to say, "You can't farm what you've already spent." He meant it as a warning about overextension, about buying inputs before the ground has told you what it needs. But I have come to think it has a second meaning, which is that the money you save by going slow and watching and reading what's already been written is money you get to use on the next thing, and the next thing, and the thing after that. And that patience is not a virtue in the sentimental sense, but a tool in the practical sense, one that you sharpen by using, and that does not rust if you put it up right. The field doesn't forget what you started. That was what my father wrote. I think he was also saying that the field doesn't forget who paid attention. I have told you most of the story now, and I want to tell you the last part, which is what happened in the fall of 2014. 5 years after the tile went in and the goats went to work and Harold made his one-sentence concession at the gate. In the fall of 2014, I found a second notebook, not my father's. This one was in a wooden crate in the back corner of the old stone spring house at the north end of the home place, the spring house that my grandfather built in 1934 and that my father kept using through the 1970s, and that I had used for storing fence wire and odd hardware since the early 1990s. The crate was a peach crate, the old kind with slat sides, and it had been under a canvas tarp that I moved to get to a box of insulators I needed for a fence repair. The notebook under the tarp was not a composition notebook. It was a pocket ledger, the kind with green-ruled pages and a red cover that used to cost about a dime at a hardware store, and which you could fit in the breast pocket of a work shirt. My grandfather's name was written inside the front cover in a penmanship that was nothing like my father's. It was a bigger, rounder hand, the kind of penmanship that people of that generation were taught in one-room schools as if penmanship were a form of character, and below his name was a date, April 1948. This was his notebook, not a reconstruction. This was the original record. I sat down on the edge of the crate in the spring house with my reading glasses on and the afternoon light coming through the south window, which is not much light, and I read it cover to cover. Most of it was what you would expect from a man farming wet bottomland in 1948. Variety notes, hay yields, a column of livestock prices going back to 1946 written in a margin, weather observations in a shorthand that I could read because it was the same shorthand my father used, which meant my father had learned it from him. But in the middle of the ledger, on a page headed with the word "Hollow" in capital letters and the date June 1951, my grandfather had written a description of the tile survey, his survey. He had paced the grade himself, which in 1951 meant walking it with a hand level and a surveyor's rod. And he had recorded the elevations at 8 points along the proposed line. And he had noted at the bottom of the page that the outlet elevation was sufficient for gravity drainage without the addition of a lift pump, which he underlined once, and beside it he wrote, "No pump needed," which he also underlined. And then in the margin beside that he wrote in a smaller hand, the way you write something when you think of it after the fact. Started 2 sections northeast corner June 1953. See if it works. There it was. June 1953. He had put 2 sections of 4-inch clay in the ground in June of 1953, which would have been a few months before he died in the winter of that year. And the "see if it works" was the last thing he had written about it, which meant the tile had gone in, and he had intended to evaluate it, and then he had not had the time. He had not quit. He had run out of road. The tile he put in June of 1953 was the tile Clyde found in the probe in August of 2009, sound and in place at 14 to 18 inches depth, 56 years in the ground without a connection and without an outlet, but otherwise exactly right, waiting for someone to come and finish the sentence. I sat in the spring house for a long time after I read that. The afternoon light moved and then it was gone, and I was sitting in the dark with the ledger in my hands, and I was thinking about a man I had never met, except in a deed and in a field and in 2 notebooks. And in the 4-inch clay tile we had pulled up out of the ground with a backhoe on an August morning and had found sound. My son had been with me that morning when Clyde found the first tile fragment. He was 16 at the time, it being August of 2009. He had looked at the piece of clay tile in Clyde's hands and asked what it was, and I had told him it was something his great-great-grandfather had put in the ground before either of us was born, and that it had been waiting for us, and my son had looked at it the way 16-year-olds look at things that are asking them to feel more than they currently know how to feel, which is with a kind of cautious respect that I found exactly right. I took the ledger back to the house and I put it with my father's composition notebook in the cedar chest, and they have been there together since, the grandfather's pocket ledger and the father's composition book. And when I open the chest now to get a document or a deed, I see them there, and I think about the way a thing can be handed from one person to another without a ceremony and without a word, simply by existing and waiting for the next person to be ready to receive it. I am 62 years old this year, which puts my birth in 1962 or thereabouts. I have been farming the home place in one capacity or another for 40 years, not counting the years I carried wire stretchers and tried to be useful. I have made mistakes that cost me money and time and some sleep, and I have gotten things right that I was not entirely sure I would get right, and the distinction between the two is almost never the thing that seemed important at the time. The distinction is almost always attention. The field doesn't forget what you started. It doesn't forgive what you quit. It also doesn't care how long you take to come back to the thing you owe it, as long as you come back. My grandfather started a sentence in June of 1953. I finished it in August of 2009. By any reasonable accounting, that is 56 years between the first clause and the last, and I will not pretend that does not weigh on me some, and the field held the space open without complaint, because a field doesn't have anywhere else to be, and neither, when you think about it, do the people whose names have been on the deed long enough to forget they can leave. If you've got a piece of ground your family called impossible, or a notebook in a cedar chest you haven't opened, or an old tile line that somebody surveyed and somebody else marked never dug, I would be glad to hear about it in the comments. Tell me what it looked like when you found it. Tell me what the animals did when you put them on it. Tell me what your grandfather underlined. There is a record somewhere of someone paying attention to the same ground you are standing on, and if you find it, and you trust it, and you're willing to spend a winter reading it, and a spring watching goats work a wet hillside before you do anything else, you might find out the ground was never poison. It was just waiting for someone to finish the question. Subscribe if this meant something. I'll be here when you're ready to talk about the next field.